So before we go into this, I just want to share something really funny, totally unrelated. Because last week I was a guest preacher at a church in Colton, and I ended up in the wrong church. So I had ended up at the church that was right next door to it, but they kind of had the same name, Community Church, and I was sitting in their parking lot for like 20 minutes. And then finally I went inside, I met the tech team, I sat in the front because they said, you can sit anywhere. I'm like, cool, this is really nice. I was realizing why the church looked different, but I just figured they did their services in the fellowship hall, and this is like the real deal. And then after they finished their Bible study, which was going on at the same time as the other church doing their Bible study, the pastor comes out, full suit, and he introduces himself. Hey, how are you doing? Oh, I'm Caesar. Oh, cool. What are you here for? Oh, I'm the guest preacher. And he's like, you mean you're here to listen to preaching? I'm like, no, I'm the guest preacher. He goes, I highly doubt that. I'm the preacher. So I had to look at the email. We both looked at it together. And then he said, oh, no, they're next door. And the funny part was that's when the rest of the congregation was coming in. So I was in the front. I had to fight my way out of the church while everyone was greeting me. I said, I'm sorry, I have to go to the other church. Why? Well, I'm the preacher over there. I got there with like 3 minutes before the service started, so. That honestly broke a lot of the nerves and tension I had then. I think it just did the same thing for me now. But on the line of going to where you're called to, today, we're not gonna continue with Luke, I'm sorry. I have not been studying Luke. Tim, one of the things he makes fun of me for is I'm Old Testament. I'm always looking backwards. Tim is New Testament. He's always looking forward. So we see different things for obvious reasons. And so today, what I'd like us to do is go into a book that I'm very familiar with and one I have a love-hate relationship. It's the book of Jonah. You may recognize the book of Jonah because we're probably familiar with it in the children version. It's one of the first ways you're introduced to the book of Jonah. I think along with this and David and Goliath and Noah's Ark, this is one of the more common ways we are introduced to the book. And a lot of us, because this is our first experience and maybe even our only experience with the book, look at it from the perspective that this is a children's story with children lessons, right? Like that's the one I have. I have many copies of like children's books of Jonah. This is the long and the short of it, right? Jonah was a prophet. He loved God, all right? He told many people about God, right? Very straightforward. And then you get to the part where he runs away, and a lot of children's books will say he ran away because he was afraid. God told him to go to Nineveh, but he was scared. He goes on top of a boat, a storm happens, and they all panic, and they ask Jonah what to do, and he says, throw me into the river, throw me into the sea. And they do, and it stops, and it's there that a whale swallows him. And he says, God, I am so sorry. And then God has the whale spit him up onto the land. He goes and he preaches all these great, amazing things. And I'm going to read you verbatim what this says here at the very end. Jonah told the people in Nineveh about God. The people believed Jonah. They wanted to know more about God. God was happy with Nineveh. God was happy with Jonah. And Jonah was happy. If you have read the book of Jonah, that is not accurate. In fact, if you really truly take a look at Jonah, this 4-chapter book, Jonah is more like a renegade. And that's what I want us to take a look at today. We're going to go through chapter 1, and honestly, the heart of what today is going to be is explaining kind of the main point of Jonah. It is a very deep and profound book, and if I'm being completely honest with you, my youth group knows this. When I finished studying the book of Jonah for school, because you're in there for 4 months, only Jonah, you don't do commentaries, you don't do culture, you don't do history, just the Bible, just Jonah. At the end, I threw my little study guide because I was so angry, because I realized I was Jonah. So, with that, let's go straight into it. We're going to go through Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 first. And this is what it says. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, Go to Nineveh, that great city, and call it against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. Very straightforward. So far, the children's book, it's got it. But there is a lot of going on just in these 5 verses. The first thing you have to be aware of, scholars have kind of found that the minor prophets in general are not isolated books. They're not isolated. In fact, what we find usually is one scroll is one complete work. This is why Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, is studied together. That is one complete work. Judges is one scroll. Ezra and Nehemiah is one scroll. And when we go to the minor prophets, we don't find one scrolls, individual scrolls. We find all 12 of them are on the same scroll. And they have historically been called the book of the 12. The book of Jonah is meant to be understood within the context of the minor prophets. And it's when you look through the context of the minor prophets, things begin to make a little bit more sense. One of the funniest ones for me is found in Hosea, the first of the minor prophets. If you go to Hosea 7:11, it reads, Ephraim is like a dove, silly and without sense, calling to Egypt, going to Assyria. The Hebrew word for dove is Jonah. It's the exact same word. The capital of Assyria is Nineveh. Ephraim, if you remember in the book of Genesis, there's this really weird part where Abraham goes to Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he claims Ephraim as his own. Ephraim represents the entirety of the northern kingdom of Israel. And now, the book of Jonah begins to make a little bit more sense. Even stranger is the book of Obadiah. The book of Obadiah talks about a group of people who are related to the Israelites. They're called the Edomites. And they have a problem with pride, and they long to see people they don't like die. Put those together, and we see what's going on with Jonah a little bit more clear. Jonah isn't just a person who's running away from ministry. This is a person who is called by God, but doesn't seem to understand the ramifications of their call. They don't seem to understand that what they're doing in their stubbornness to get things done their way, to even judge according to what they think is right and wrong, that they are incredibly silly. This is what you would have read before coming to Jonah. And so it begins with this call, this commissioning of Jonah. And what's interesting is when you go through the minor prophets and the rest of the prophets in general, there's a pattern. When God calls someone to ministry, he reveals himself in some sort of splendor, something magnificent, like Moses in the burning bush, or Isaiah when he sees the very glory of God in the temple. And usually they are afraid. They panic. Moses panics. He says, I can't talk. I'm bad of speech. Isaiah says, woe is me, for I am an unclean man of unclean lips. Gideon, my funniest one, God reveals himself. He jumps into a hole. That's how scared he is. And every time when someone has an issue with the calling they have, God gives him the same response. My presence is with you. Now, going to Jonah, we see something similar. We see that Jonah is called to do a mission, but that's it. Clearly, there's a problem why he doesn't want to do this. And then we get this odd phrase where Jonah is trying to run away from the presence of God. Now, we think that's silly. You can't run away from God. God is everywhere. But this is where that punch comes in. It's not that he's trying to run away from like the literal presence of God. God gives that as a guarantee that the mission is going to be successful. Jonah's trying to sabotage something. That's absolutely insane. A guarantee that the will of God is going to work, and you have a prophet, someone who is supposed to represent God, someone who knows the word, someone who knows what God has called us to do, for some reason is trying to go against it. That should ring a lot of alarms. And so he goes into the ship, and it tells us that on the ship, this gigantic storm begins to happen. These people are panicking, they're throwing things, and at the very end, it mentions that's when Jonah decided to go underneath to sleep. We see danger coming, and he chooses to do nothing about it. So I'm phrasing it in this way to kind of help you catch the nuance that the book of Jonah is trying to show. These things are bad things Jonah is doing. So should we be like Jonah? Yes or no? No, not like that. And so, let's keep going. Verse 6. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." So whose idea is it to pray in the story? The believer or the non-believer? The non-believer. That's weird. Shouldn't it be the instinct of the believer to go to God? He is being called out for not behaving according to the character of God, according to the way we are meant to behave, by a non-believer. It's one of these funny things that may happen in life. Someone outside of the church may call you out for a way you should be behaving as a believer. This is just done funny. If you pay close attention, the captain is actually saying the same things God said. Arise and go. God told him to arise and go, but instead Jonah goes up to run down. Everything from verse 1 to 5 is Jonah constantly going downwards in the story. You see, he went down to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa to go down to Tarshish. And then when he's on the boat, he goes down into the boat. He is on a downward descent when God has called him to go upwards. The book is trying to tell us there's intentionality to Jonah doing the opposite. To even the believers are noticing he's doing something, or the non-believers are noticing he's doing something different from what he's meant to do. You see now why I got mad at the book of Jonah? So, let's keep going. Verse 7. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lots fell on Jonah. And they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he told them. It's okay to laugh. He's meant to look goofy. But notice, he says, "Oh, I fear God." But in the midst of the storm, who are the ones afraid? The non-believers. Everything they do screams that they are aware that what's going on is an act of God. And they want to see how is it we can be saved. And so they start throwing cargo. These are mariners. The way they make their living is with the cargo that they have. And they find it's better to get rid of the cargo to find life. And Jonah doesn't care. Jonah goes down to sleep. And so when you look at these people who are absolutely panicking, going to their gods, casting lots, trying to figure out what can we do to save ourselves, that is a fear. But when Jonah says, "Oh yeah, I know, I'm scared of God too," there's something amiss. What he says is not matching with what he's doing. Are we the same? Do we say that we fear the Lord, but in everything we do screams that we don't. It's a scary thought. But one, the book of Jonah is itching to make us answer. Are we behaving like Jonah in this case? I love that the fact that he also tells them the whole story. Yeah, I know me and God. He told me to go to Nineveh. I said, no. Here I am. I decided to take a nap once the storm hit us. We're good. So they understand the whole situation, and even they are saying, this is ridiculous. You should not be. This is totally wrong. Verse 11. Then he said to them, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. They are faced with death. And they're asking the representative of God, what should we do to live? And he said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Ready? Whose idea is it to get thrown into the water? Jonah. Does it tell us God told him? Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh. This sea is so strong it's breaking a ship. What would happen if you threw a person in there? They would what? Die. So if Jonah was thrown into the water, he would probably what? Die. And if he dies, does that mean he goes to Nineveh? This is very odd. The book doesn't make clear whether this is from God or not. It's meant to make us wonder, to make us contemplate why would he suggest this. And you would think pagans, right? Because we've heard the different things about pagans. The Old Testament makes a very, very clear picture that the pagans in this time, in these regions, all about human sacrifice. So what do you think should the pagans' response be to the idea of a human sacrifice to a piece of God? Should they be for it or against it? Should be for it. Verse 13. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. They don't want to do it. You know what's interesting? When it says they tried to turn back to dry land, that's the Hebrew word shuv, the word used over and over again into repentance. So even though it's not used in the term of repentance here, it's at least connected to the pagans. When offered to do what they normally do, sacrifice a human to be saved and appease the gods, they choose not to. And dry land over and over again in the Old Testament is used as a sign of deliverance. When God saved Noah, he put him on dry land. When God split the seas for the Israelites, they got to walk on dry land. When it comes to the dangers of water, God always provides dry land. They, on their own terms and on their own way from what they could possibly understand, are trying to go to dry land. And they turn away from the idea that they're used to, this of the world. But it doesn't work. Therefore, verse 14, they called out to the Lord. Notice, therefore they called out to the Lord. Notice, it's in all caps. That's where the name of God is in the Hebrew text. So it's, they called out to Yahweh by name. O Yahweh, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Yahweh, have done as it pleased you. The best way I can explain this is they don't know what to do, so they go to God. And they say, this is the only thing we can see to be done, so forgive us if what we're doing is wrong. We don't know what else there is. And so they throw him. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. So if Jonah fell into that sea, he was going to die. And the moment he hits the water, the storm stops. Jonah's plan failed. Verse 16, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, so even more than before, and they offered a sacrifice to Yahweh and made vows. How crazy is it that even when this prophet's trying to run away, has no intention of really going to God, does God still use it? And these pagans, these people who do not know God, behave more like God's people and turn to him and are saved by him. This book is absolutely amazing. And that's just how the first chapter ends. If you go through a lot of children's stories, you read that the time that he's inside the whale, he prays saying, I'm sorry. We won't go through it, but if you go through chapter 2, it doesn't say that he apologizes. It's a very ambiguous, I guess I'm here. What's even more crazy is every single line of his prayer isn't even his own words. They're all quotes from different parts of the Bible, from Psalms, from Lamentations. His whole prayer is just from other places of the Bible. The last time I got to share with you, I talked about when you go and you pray to God, asking for forgiveness. The way he prays to God here is just by quoting verses. And people wonder why. Some people think maybe he's just trying to say very nice, pretty things to get God off of his back. Is that what we do? Do we treat the Bible like a magic spell book? If I say this one, maybe God will be happy with me. But even though it's ambiguous whether God or whether Jonah is asking for forgiveness or not, the one thing that is clear is regardless, God still shows mercy to him. If you go through Deuteronomy, God makes it clear that if a prophet is given a word from God and refuses to give it, he should be put to death. And God still saves him from death. He doesn't deserve it, and yet God still forgave him. Well, not forgave him. The text doesn't tell us that. But spared him, showed mercy to him, gave him a chance to cool down and even come back to him. And the text doesn't tell us whether he does or doesn't. What it does tell us is after 3 days, he is brought back to Nineveh. And God tells him, I want you to say what I tell you. And so Jonah goes. It says the town is so big, it takes 3 days to get from point A to point B in the town of Nineveh. And he only goes 1 day in. He walks up and says, 40 days, you're all dead. Walks away. The word here, there, he doesn't say dead, but you're destroyed. It's a very weird word because it can mean two things. But what we hear and what we read is 40 days you'll be destroyed. And everyone in Nineveh hears those 5 Hebrew words. And the king humbles himself. He drops himself from the throne. He covers himself in ashes. He puts himself in sackcloth and says, let us turn away from the evil we have done. If you've noticed, I haven't even told you what the Ninevites have done. The book doesn't tell us explicitly. The king says, from the violence in our hands. Going back to the minor prophets helping us understand, Nahum tells us their sin. They killed so many people, you were tripping on their victims more than stones. And they turned away from their sins. They fasted. They fasted so extremely, their cows were fasting with them. If you want an example of what repentance looks like, the Ninevites are one of the greatest examples of repentance, of turning away from your sin and going to God. And if you look at their prayer in chapter 3, they don't even know God's name. They just pray to God. And the very end of chapter 3 says, and God turned away his anger and destruction he had for them. So the Ninevites turned away from their sin. God turns his anger away. And so we're left with, what now with Jonah? I frame it this way because we still don't know why Jonah's doing this. And this is where a lot of people want to put speculation, where you normally hear he was probably afraid. But this is the gut punch. We're going to read chapter 4, the first few verses together. This is what it says. This is after Jonah saw that the Ninevites are not going to be killed by God. And so he walks out, he leaves, he goes, and this is what it says. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to Yahweh and said, "O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? This is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, Yahweh, take my life, kill me, for it's better for me to die than to live." And the Lord said, "Do you do well to be angry?" Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. This is the gut punch. He's angry that God showed mercy to the people he hates. He, within his own mind, had decided that they should die. They should never experience God's love. They should go to hell. He is angry that the God who is so eager to extend love and mercy has given love and mercy. This is that connection to Obadiah. This is extremely wrong. Let's be honest, right? This coming year, Tim has expressed over and over again that this is one of the most difficult times that can happen within our country because politics comes up. And oftentimes what you end up seeing is people within the arguments and the heat of the discourse, oftentimes you will see and hear people like Jonah expressing so much how this group of people or this ideology or whatever it may be have no reason to deserve or experience God's love, grace, and forgiveness. They within themselves have decided who is worthy of the gospel and therefore refuse to give it. And the book of Jonah makes them, people who behave like this, look like fools. The question here that God proposes to him, do you have any right to be angry? Is directed to people like us who feel that way. Like, forgive me, there's an example is very, very poignant when I was in high school. This isn't to start politics or anything, but just the example. When I was a sophomore here in Cambly High School, there was a shootout that had happened in Florida at this one bar that was known for having, gay people there. And it was shot up. I think 11 people died. What I heard in Cambly was good. They didn't deserve life. This was from believers. People have said, anything related to that. I say that because it's not something far. It's something that is relevant. It's something that is found within our midst. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be political ideology. There are so many people within our heart we probably do hate. And whether we realize it or not, by us not giving them the gospel, we behave no more than Jonah. We are the renegade. We are meant to be bearers of God's name. In the same way we behave like Jonah, turning our backs, not wanting to do what we're called, God still gives his love and mercy for us, not because we deserve it, but that is because who he is. It is so transformative. We are meant to go and do that to everyone. Show them what the love of God is like. How despite our past, God sees past it so he can redeem us and restore us. This is that gut punch that Jonah has. I even love how God ends the book. He doesn't end it like a normal book. This is how it ends. Because Jonah keeps saying, I'd rather die than be alive, over and over and over again. And he says, and the Lord said, this is verse 10. God gives him a plant dies, Jonah's mad, he's lost his shade. You pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night. and perished in the night. And should I not have pity on Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 1,200 persons who do not know their left from their right, and also their cattle? This is God's perspective on people outside of the faith. Shouldn't I have pity on them? They don't know better. That is a question I have to ask myself often when I get frustrated with people, whether they cut you off, right? Or you have that one really, really nasty YouTube post or Facebook post, especially people who most certainly want to bash against the faith. This is the question I have to ask myself over and over and over again. Shouldn't I have pity on them? Shouldn't I feel for them? They don't know left and right. They don't know what it's like to be here. Shouldn't I have a heart soft like God's? In the same way his heart is soft for me, in all of my stubbornness, all of my failings, all my empty promises, should I not have the same for him, for them? And I think this is the heart of the book, to be honest. Are we like Jonah, deciding on behalf of God who is worthy of the gospel and choosing to not spread it? Is that who we are? And the book ends with the question we are now meant to answer. Shouldn't God have pity on them? There's no answer to the book because we individually are meant to answer it. If your answer is yes, then what should you do? Go and spread the gospel. But if your answer is no, then it means we need a lot more maturing to do. Amen? That's my hope for us. Let's show our community what the love of Christ looks like. Be all about Christ. Be all about grace. Be all about that redemption. Because that's what God gives to us every single day.